Hello and welcome to Indus News, live from Islamabad. I am Munib Ahmed with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. Brazil has reported record daily deaths from coronavirus as more than 3,200 people died overnight. Meanwhile, India has recorded this year's highest daily COVID-19 deaths with 275 fatalities in a day. Pakistan has registered over 3,300 new cases and 30 fatalities overnight as the death toll approaches 14,000. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.7 million lives and infected 124 million people so far. United States President Joe Biden says he does not consider North Korea's launch of short-range missiles as a provocation. Talking to media in Washington, Biden said the Pentagon called the launch business as usual. This comes after South Korea said Pyongyang fired two short-range non-ballistic cruise missiles off the west coast on Sunday. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is predicted to fall short of securing the seats needed to form a new government in the country's fourth election in 2 years. Exit polls show Netanyahu's Likud party and its allies are projected to win 53 seats in the 120-seat parliament. Myanmar's military has freed hundreds of demonstrators arrested during its brutal crackdown on protest. Many businesses in Yangon remained shut and streets were deserted after activists called for a silent strike. This comes after violence by the junta claimed its youngest victim, a 7-year-old girl. Well, these are top stories. News in detail after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now let's start with the corona pandemic. Brazil has reported record daily deaths from coronavirus as more than 3,200 people died overnight. Meanwhile, India has recorded this year's highest daily COVID-19 deaths with 275 fatalities. Globally, the virus has claimed over 2.7 million lives and infected more than 124 million people so far. More on the pandemic in this report.
Vaccine problems, protests, and new restrictions this week has been difficult for governments with regard to COVID-19 after U.S. health experts publicly criticized AstraZeneca for using outdated information to show how well the immunization worked. The drug maker says it will publish up-to-date results from its major U.S. vaccine trial within 48 hours. But despite this criticism, Canada says the Oxford vaccine is safe and it will continue to be recommended for use. Meanwhile, amid WHO's warning of COVID-19 surging dangerously in Brazil and protests across the country against his handling of the outbreak, President Jair Bolsonaro defended his pandemic response.
The virus has arrived and it is being confronted by us and it will soon pass. Our life must go on, jobs should be kept, the livelihoods of the families should be kept. We should return to normality.
Europe seems to be shutting down again amid forlorn hopes of normalcy. Norway is introducing new national measures and will postpone the introduction of a plan to reopen society. Spain, however, will lift restrictions on arrivals from Britain on the 30th of March that have been in place since December. As the UK marked the first anniversary of the lockdown, Prime Minister Boris Johnson admitted the government's miscalculations about the virus.
The single biggest false assumption that we made was about the potential for asymptomatic transmission, and that did govern a lot of policy in the early days, or that misunderstanding about the reality of asymptomatic transmission certainly led to real problems.
Hong Kong authorities have suspended vaccinations with 2 batches of Pfizer's shot, citing defective packaging. In Australia, vaccine rollout experienced significant week 1 delivery errors, including a failure of shipments of needles to accompany the vials.
Meanwhile, Pakistan has recorded over 3,000 COVID-19 cases for the 7th consecutive day. The Health Ministry said over 3,300 people contracted the virus overnight. The ministry said 30 more people died from the coronavirus since yesterday, taking the toll to nearly 14,000. The country has so far recorded more than 637,000 cases, of which over 586,000 have recovered. The number of active cases in the country has crossed 36,000. The ministry said more than 2,500 people are in critical condition across the country. Meanwhile, the government will announce its decision regarding easing or tightening COVID-19 restrictions today. United States President Joe Biden says he does not consider North Korea's launch of short-range missiles as a provocation. This comes after South Korea said Pyongyang fired 2 non-ballistic cruise missiles off the west coast. Talking to the media in Washington, Biden said the Pentagon called the launch business as usual. Other officials of the Biden administration said the activity involved weapons systems at the low end of the spectrum. They said these missiles were not covered by the UN Security Council. The launch marks North Korea's first publicly known weapons test since Biden took office in January. Now, in Israel's 4th elections in 2 years, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is predicted to fall short of securing enough seats to form a government again. Exit polls show Netanyahu's Likud party and its allies are projected to win 53 seats in the 120-seat parliament. Polls predict that opposition parties set to win 60 seats. Netanyahu's rival and blue and white party leader Benny Gantz says he will do everything to unite the pro-change bloc. If negotiations to form a government fail again, it could force the 5th elections. Israel's Central Elections Committee says the final official results will most likely be announced by Wednesday. Now, just over 67.2% of those eligible cast their ballots in the elections. Now, the Middle East Quartet says its members have discussed the resumption of meaningful talks to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The envoys of the United Nations, Russia, and the US and the European Union held a virtual meeting. The United Nations said the negotiations will lead to a 2-state solution, including tangible steps to advance freedom and security. In a statement, it said prosperity for Palestinians and Israelis is important in its own right. The organization said the envoys also discussed the unsustainable disparity in economic development between Israelis and Palestinians. There have been no substantive peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians since 2014. Meanwhile, Myanmar's military has freed hundreds of demonstrators arrested during its brutal crackdown on protests. This comes after violence by the junta claimed its youngest victim, a 7-year-old girl. Witnesses say several buses full of prisoners drove out of Yangon's insane jail in the morning. Many businesses in the city remained shut and streets were deserted after activists called for a silent strike. The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners says at least 2,000 people have been arrested since the February 1st coup. The army has conceded the deaths of 164 protesters, including 9 security officers. But activists say at least 261 people have been killed so far. Moving on now, Russia has proposed Turkey reopen 3 crossing points in Syria's Idlib and Aleppo starting from 25th of March. These comments were carried by Russian state media and attributed to the Center for Syrian Reconciliation. Moscow says the recommendation is in line with the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Earlier, Turkey conveyed its objections and concerns about a recent flare-up of violence in northwest Syria to Russia's envoy. This came after Russian jets hit towns near the Turkish border and a hospital in the region. Now, a relief agency says children in Yemen accounted for a quarter of civilian casualties in the last 3 years of war. In a report, Save the Children said more than 2,300 children were killed between 2018 and 2020. The agency said the actual number of deaths is likely to be much higher. It said the conflict has also led to serious threats to children's safety and well-being. It added In 2020, the agency identified 316 child survivors of at least one of the 6 grave violations against children in conflict. Earlier, UNICEF issued a statement saying in March alone, 8 children were killed and 33 injured in Yemen. It said the casualties happened in several areas where fighting between government forces and the Houthis has recently intensified. Now, President Emmanuel Macron says France will reopen its embassy in Libyan capital Tripoli on the 29th of March. He added the move is to show support for the new Libyan authorities. Talking to media in Paris, Macron called for all foreign forces and fighters to leave Libya. He said Paris and its European partners were united in backing the ceasefire. He said France wishes to unify the national army, financial institutions and work towards planned elections at the end of the year. Paris closed its embassy after evacuating 50 French and British nationals as fighting broke out in Tripoli in July 2014. The United States and Mexico have discussed ways to protect migrants amid the escalating border crisis. This comes after U.S. President Joe Biden sent envoys to Mexico to seek help on the flow of migrants. White House Border Coordinator Roberta Jacobson met Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard in Mexico City. In a statement, Mexico's foreign ministry said the talks aimed at mitigating the root causes of migration. It said the officials discussed different mechanisms for orderly and safe migration and protection of human rights.
This communication will continue. We have not reached a definitive point. It was not the objective of the meeting. The objective was to exchange points of view and information. I thank you for having visited our country, for having accepted this invitation from the Mexican government. I will continue to report on progress we are making. For the time being, good communication, increasingly better and closer relations between both countries.
More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. Pakistan says world must acknowledge the pleas of women enduring devastating human rights situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Minister for Human Rights Shireen Mazari said this while addressing the 65th session of the UN Commission on Status of Women. She said sustainable peace and economic growth are impossible without women empowerment. Shireen Mazari said Pakistan remains loyal to creating a safe environment for women and empowering them. The minister urged the world to reflect on the challenges women face for equal participation in public decision-making. Mazari said Pakistan has adopted several key international commitments to gender equality. She said the pandemic has served to highlight the significant role of women across the globe despite the challenges. The UN Human Rights Council has adopted a China-sponsored resolution on human rights cooperation. Beijing says Cuba, Russia, Eritrea and other countries voiced their support for the resolution at the meeting. Beijing's envoy to United Nations, Chen Shu, said China's initiative is in line with the aspirations of the international community. The resolution, titled Promoting Mutually Beneficial Cooperation in the Field of Human Rights, it calls on states and stakeholders to engage in constructive dialogue based on impartiality, objectivity and mutual respect. It also emphasizes the need for active global cooperation to respond effectively to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in Democratic Republic of the Congo, President Denis Sassou Nguesso has been re-elected for a fourth term with 88% of the vote. The victory has extended his 36-year-long rule despite a prolonged economic crisis. The main opposition party boycotted the polls while 2 of his other main rivals were convicted of crimes after the last election in 2016. His closest rival, Guy Price Parfait Colelas, who died hours after the polls closed, received less than 8%. In his victory speech, Sassou said he feels great responsibility, especially towards young people. Sassou changed the constitution in 2015 to extend terms limits. Congo's economy has been in crisis since 2014 when oil prices collapsed, soaring the external debt. Now, two individuals have found an unlikely friendship thanks to technology during the lockdowns around the world. Through Skype, a young Brit and an old French woman have been in touch online for the past 6 months. Let's find out in this report.
For 98-year-old Jacqueline Tolu and 20-year-old Elliot Bellman, COVID-19 upset their lives, but also forged an unlikely friendship. Tolu has endured isolation in her care home near Paris, while for Bellman, the virus ruined his plans to be in France to study French. For the past 6 months, a scheme called Cher Ami that pairs elderly people with language students has been helpful for both of them.
I was nervous. There's meeting a new person, completely different generation, different culture, different language, obviously. So it's nerve-wracking. Thinking about maybe we don't get on, maybe she doesn't like me, maybe just like that generational gap would be too much because we've got such distinct views of political structures and cultures and so forth. But as soon as I started talking to her, she's very, as you'll see tomorrow, she's very easy to talk to. She's very funny. She just keeps the conversations going so easily.
On their weekly Monday call, Bellman dialed in from his bedroom in southern England, where he has been riding out the pandemic, while Tolu joined while sitting in a wheelchair at her care home in Bonneuil-sur-Marne. Tolu now has someone to talk to and relieve her loneliness, while Bellman has an opportunity to practice his French with a native speaker. But more importantly, they hit it off.
Oui, j'aime bien le lundi.
I said yes, I would like to speak to a young person. And at the same time, it will surely be of benefit for them to speak to me. And for me too, for my morale, and there you go. That's why I accepted it, as it would make me happy.
Tolu says their chats allow her, at least in her mind, to escape the confines of the care home for a little while every week.
Well, now it's business stories. Most shares in the Asia-Pacific are trading largely lower. Extended anti-coronavirus lockdowns in Europe clouded the outlook for economic recovery and shook investors' confidence. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index is leading losses, diving over 2%. The Nikkei 225 in Japan has also tumbled close to 2%. Mainland Chinese shares have descended over 1%, while Seoul's Kospi has slipped marginally as well. However, the ASX 200 in Australia has gained 0.5%. With that, we come to the end of this news bulletin. For the latest update, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.